Hi guy, welcome back TV Spoilers. Young and the Restless Spoilers Sharon Newman didn't walk into a long-awaited romantic moment the way she'd been hoping to. She walked straight into a nightmare disguised as silence. The room was too quiet in a way that made her heart tighten on instinct. Some silences aren't peaceful at all, they're the warning sign of something collapsing in real time. Only no one has been brave enough to name it yet. Sharon had always been used to Nick carrying a certain kind of heat, whether it was anger, pain, frustration, or simply the weight of his presence shifting the air around him. But this time, that heat was gone. Nick lay unnaturally still, not the kind of sleep that comes after exhaustion, but the kind of stillness that makes you want to scream while your lungs refuse to cooperate. Sharon froze for half a beat, her mind exploding with questions at once. But none of them made it to her lips. All she felt was cold sliding down her spine when she realized her eyes were witnessing something Genoa City had shown too many times before. A man who'd once dominated every battlefield, now taken down by the very thing he believed he controlled. The moment Sharon understood Nick might have overdosed didn't arrive with some dramatic, obvious clue. It came through the smallest and cruelest detailed way. His unconsciousness looked too clean, too smooth, as if his body had been locked out of the world. Real pain usually makes people twitch, groan, fight. This wasn't fighting. This felt like surrender, and it terrified her. Sharon dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking so badly that even touching him felt like she might break something that couldn't be repaired. She searched for the proof of breath, for any sign that he was still here, and that slow, uneven rhythm nearly crushed the logic out of her. In that instant, old memories circled every close call, every time they'd nearly lost each other, every season where love had meant surviving the fallout of their own mistakes. She dared to believe they were being handed another chance, a chance that would finally feel grown-up and steady. But in Genoa City, hope was always the first thing fate hunted, and it seemed determined to rip it away the second Sharon let herself reach for it. Sharon refused to collapse. She moved like someone trained for crisis. Even though the truth was her heart was cracking in her chest, she called for an ambulance so fast her words scraped her throat raw. She didn't waste time explaining more than necessary because she understood something brutal. In moments like this, one late second can turn into forever. She kept her eyes on Nick as if looking away would make him vanish. The waiting minutes stretched longer than a lifetime, and Sharon felt herself pulled into a vicious mental war. Half of her prayed this was only exhaustion, only the pain finally winning. The other half recognized the ugly truth about painkillers, and the lie people feed themselves. Just one more. Sharon had seen that lie destroy lives, and what scared her most wasn't only Nick's condition, but the possibility that he'd been slipping quietly while she was busy believing they were finally okay. Nick Newman had been carrying more than the physical damage from the car crash and the injury to his leg. He carried the habit of trying to be the man who never needs rescuing. He hated feeling weak. He hated being seen as someone who required care. And that pride was exactly what made pain medication feel like salvation. At first, it was just a tool to get through the ache, to stand upright, to keep moving, to prove he was still Nick Newman, still unbreakable. But the real problem was that Nick wasn't following the doctor's orders. He wouldn't let his body heal at its own pace. He wouldn't let himself truly rest. Instead, he chose the shortcut. And shortcuts in pain always come with a price no one recognizes until they've already gone into debt. When Nick started swallowing pain pills like candy, it wasn't only carelessness, it was quiet desperation. He needed control back, and the pills gave it to him, at least for a few short hours. Lately, the story hadn't needed someone to announce out loud that Nick was addicted for the danger to be obvious. The warning signs were already there in the way he struggled, in the way he kept pushing far beyond what his body could handle, in the way he bristled whenever anyone suggested he slow down. Sharon had seen it, even if part of her hadn't wanted to admit it. She knew Nick. She knew his ego, his need to stand tall, his fear of being pitied. She knew he'd rather bleed in private than let anyone hold him up. And yet, understanding a person can trap you in compassion when what they need is something sharper, something decisive. Sharon had waited for Nick to speak first, to confess, to trust her enough to loosen his grip. But Nick chose silence because silence was easier than admitting something was controlling him. And now that silence was lying on the bed in front of her, cold and punishing, forcing both of them to face the truth they'd been dodging. The tragedy of Schick had never been only about enemies outside their door or the chaos that always seemed to circle Genoa City. More often, it came from the cracks inside them, things they didn't say, the battles they insisted on fighting alone. That had always been their pattern. Every time they moved closer, life threw a new obstacle in their path, as if testing whether they deserved the happiness they kept reaching for. And this time, the obstacle came in the shape of a pill bottle. It came with hospital lights and sirens and a helplessness Sharon hated most of all. The realization that her love wasn't enough to pull Nick out of pain if he refused to turn back himself. She feared the mood swings and strange behaviors that addiction could unleash out. It might twist Nick into someone sharper, harsher, more suspicious. A version of him that slammed doors in her face when she tried to get close. Sharon feared becoming the woman who had to save him over and over again, watching him slide further and paying for it with the stability she'd worked so hard to build inside herself. When the ambulance arrived and the moment shifted into full emergency mode, Sharon felt like the world split into layers. One layer was the chaos of paramedics, the stretcher, the monitors, the clipped instructions that sounded almost unreal. The other layer was a deep, hollow space opening inside her, as if her body was walking while her soul stayed behind in the moment. She'd first seen Nick unconscious. Sharon wanted to shake him awake and tell him he didn't have to fight alone anymore, that they'd come back together to survive as a team, not to keep losing each other in new ways. But Sharon also knew the darker truth: nobody becomes addicted because they're happy. People become addicted because they're running from physical pain, from fear, from emptiness they can't name. And if Nick was running, Sharon had to face the most painful question of all: what was he trying to escape in his life? And in this relationship? What terrified Sharon wasn't only the possibility of losing Nick. It was the dread that if he woke up, he might not be the man she'd just let herself hope for again. Sharon understood what drugs could do to the mind. They didn't only numb pain, they numbed reality. Nick might wake up denying everything, furious, insisting he was fine, accusing Sharon of overreacting. And if that happened, Sharon would be dragged back into the same old cycle, loving Nick while constantly protecting herself from the storms inside him. Sharon had promised herself this reunion would be different, that she wouldn't trade her peace to keep a love that kept breaking. But standing beside the gurney, watching Nick fade in and out of medical urgency, all her principles began to melt. Because love, no matter how mature you think it is, one fatal weakness. It refuses to listen to reason when the person you love is hovering at the edge of life and death. At the hospital, Sharon sat waiting, and the waiting felt like being suspended over a cliff by a thread. She couldn't do anything except replay every small sign she might have ignored: Nick flinching in pain, but insisting he was fine, the strange quietness, the sudden snap of irritation, the frantic way he'd searched for pills. Sharon wondered when it had begun. Was it a slow, invisible descent? Or had it accelerated recently because Nick kept pushing past his limits? Worse than that, she wondered if Nick had ever wanted to tell her but stopped because he was afraid she'd see him differently. Sometimes the fear of disappointing the person you love is exactly what drives you deeper into self-destructs. Sharon hated that possibility. She hated that Nick might have chosen loneliness even while she was right there. But Sharon wasn't blameless either. She knew she had a habit of believing in the best version of Nick, especially when her own longing for happiness was so raw it could blind her. She'd craved peace for so long that she'd started to convince herself every warning sign was temporary. She wanted to believe life owed them a softer ending, that they'd already paid enough. But Genoa City never worked on fairness. It worked on pressure. And this pressure had no obvious villain Sharon could point at and hate. This villain was invisible. It was pain. It was dependence. It was one small choice repeated again and again until it became a chain. Right as Sharon forced herself not to break, another thought sliced through her like glass: even if Nick survived, this wouldn't be something they simply got through. It would reshape their future. If addiction had truly taken root, it would wedge itself into every ordinary day. It would turn peace into vigilance. It would make Sharon the person always scanning for disaster. It would force Nick into a war against himself, and in wars like that, the people you love most are often the ones who bleed the deepest. Sharon wasn't afraid of hardship. She was afraid of becoming to people who loved each other in pain instead of to people who loved each other into healing. And then, when the doors of the emergency room finally opened, Sharon sprang to her feet. Her entire body stretched so tight that even a single sentence could shatter her. She searched the doctor's eyes for hope. But what she saw was a seriousness that couldn't be softened. Time seemed to stall, not because she heard the final verdict, but because she understood that whatever came next, her life with Nick was about to enter a new chapter on they could never return from untouched. Yet right as Sharon braced herself to face the truth, her phone vibrated in her hand like an alarm. A new notification flashed across the screen. and the blood drained from her face. There was a message from Nixon. Only minutes before he collapsed. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a quiet confession Sharon hadn't even opened yet. But it was already enough to tell her the worst part. Nick had known he was falling for a long time. He just chose not to let anyone pull him back until now. Matt's condition is at a critical red alert level. And that fact hangs over Genoa City like a dark cloud that refuses to move. When someone is pushed to the edge between life and death, everything around them tightens. Every relationship, every decision, every secret becomes sharper, more dangerous, more brittle. And I've always felt that in Y&R, tragedy rarely arrives as something truly sudden. It builds quietly. It layers itself on top of the characters day after day, fracture after fracture, until one final touchstone tiny push makes the whole structure collapse. For Nick, after weeks of extreme pressure in his war against Matt Clark to save Sienna, that final touch came in the coldest way possible: total exhaustion. Not the kind of tiredness that disappears after a long nap, but the kind that empties a person down to the bone, until the body finally betrays the will that keeps insisting it can fight a little longer. Nick fought like he wasn't allowed to weaken, like one moment of hesitation would mean Sienna was lost forever. But no one can live in that kind of battle stance without consequences. And the consequences don't always explode on the battlefield where everyone can see them. Sometimes they detonate in a quiet living room behind a locked door, where no one arrives in time to hear the warning. Sharon came to Nick's house at a moment when she simply wanted to make sure he was still standing. She'd watched him carry too much for too long. And what hurts me the most is the way Sharon always seems forced to remain at the edge of the storm, trying to hold the man she loves steady, but never quite able to step into the center of the chaos and carry the burden for him. Everything involving Matt Clark, every brutal confrontation, every decision Nick had to make, every second he had to hold his ground and act like the man who never breaks, it all carved at him in ways people can't always recognize from the outside. Sharon understood more than anyone, yet understanding isn't the same as stopping a collapse. From the moment she stood at Nick's door, unease clung to her like a bad instinct. Nick didn't answer. There were no footsteps, no familiar movement, no signs of life continuing normally behind the door. Sometimes one silence is enough to make fear bloom. Sharon knocked again, trying to hold onto calm, but the longer the quiet dragged on, the harder her heart pounded, like it was trying to outrun whatever she was about to find. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. And the first thing she noticed wasn't a clear image, it was the atmosphere. The air felt wrong, heavy with an unnatural stillness that was more frightening than shouting. As Sharon's eyes swept across the living room, she realized the place didn't feel like Nick. It was messy, scattered, like an invisible fight had taken place. Or maybe Nick had tried to stay awake, tried to hold on to control, and eventually lost. The room carried the suffocating scent of prolonged stress, as if fear had been trapped here for days without ever being allowed to escape. Sharon moved farther in. And I can almost feel that moment, the way your body knows you're about to see a truth you never wanted to face. There's a very human kind of terror in it, the urge to run forward to confirm what's happening, mixed with the instinct to freeze because you're afraid that once you see it, you'll never be the same again. Nick was lying unconscious on the living room floor. It didn't look like a man who had simply passed out from fatigue. It had that terrifying sense of disconnection, as if his body was present but he wasn't. Sharon dropped beside him, calling his name, shaking him, trying to pull him back with nothing but her voice and her trembling hands. But Nick didn't respond, and that lack of response set Sharon's panic on fire. Nearby was a strange pill bottle with no label, sitting there like a silent accusation. I think that detail is especially cruel because it isn't just an object, it's a question. It's a blade suspended in the air. It refuses to let Sharon soothe herself with the idea that this is only exhaustion. A bottle with no source turns the scene from accident into suspicion, from burnout into mystery, from a medical emergency into a secret that might destroy everything once it's spoken out loud. Sharon tried again, as if calling Nick hard enough could drag him back. But his body stayed still. In Sharon's mind, the past weeks replayed like a violent montage, Nick constantly confronting Matt Clark, fighting to rescue Sienna, forcing himself to keep moving like his strength was endless. Y&R is devastatingly good at reminding us that people don't collapse because of one single moment. They collapse because of every moment they swallowed, every fear they buried, every weakness they refused to admit. Nick held his breath emotionally for too long. He became a shield for too long. And when someone lives like a shield, they don't notice themselves growing thinner, cracking bit by bit until one final impact shatters them. Sharon remembered all of it not only because she needed an explanation, but because she was blaming herself. Why didn't she come sooner? Why didn't she see it happening? Why did she let herself believe Nick could push through everything on sheer willpower? Sharon called 911 with a voice that barely sounded like her own. It wasn't a gentle tremble, it was the kind of shaking that comes from terror squeezing the lungs. She tried to describe Nick's condition quickly and clearly, but every word scraped her throat. And in moments like this, the truth is people don't always cry. Sometimes they become frighteningly practical. Sharon had no space left for romance, no space for old promises or sweet memories. She had one task: keep Nick alive. And that's what makes this so brutal to watch. Becca's love in moments like this isn't beautiful. It's survival. It's the willingness to throw away pride, comfort, even personal safety, just to buy the person you love one more breath. The paramedics arrived fast, and Nick's home instantly transformed into an emergency zone. The medical procedures were cold and precise, and Sharon watched through eyes that were trembling with helplessness. In a crisis like this, sound becomes strange. You don't fully hear anything. You only feel your own heartbeat pounding like a drum. The questions began immediately about the mysterious pill bottle, what it was, where it came from, how much Nick might have taken. Each question hit Sharon like a stone to the chest. Because suddenly she wasn't just the woman trying to save him. She was the woman who might know something. She wasn't ready for that role. Sharon only wanted Nick to open his eyes, but the world doesn't allow simplicity. It demands details. It demands truth. It demands payment. And here, Sharon faced the hardest choice of all, a choice that makes the entire storyline darker, sharper, more real. Sharon could tell the medical team about the pill bottle so they could treat Nick properly, with full information. But if she told them, she would also be opening the door to consequences she couldn't control: suspicion, investigation, questions about what Nick had been doing in these past weeks, questions about whether he'd crossed into something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. If Sharon hid the bottle or stayed silent, she might protect Nick from immediate fallout, but the cost could be his life. If the doctors didn't know the true cause, this wasn't a simple moral puzzle. It was a psychological trap. It forced Sharon to choose between truth and survival, between saving Nick right now and shielding him from what might come next. And I feel for Sharon here, because she should never have been the one forced to decide this in the middle of terror. But life in Genoa City always makes her carry choices she never asked for. There was another fear beneath that decision, the fear that if Sharon spoke up, she would be admitting something she wasn't ready to believe, that Nick had reached a point where he was taking unknown medication, something unmarked, something that didn't belong in his home. That confession would destroy the illusion Sharon might still be holding on to, the illusion that Nick was still in control. Sometimes people hide the truth not because they're cruel, but because they aren't strong enough to live inside that truth yet. Sharon stood right at that cliff. On one side was the raw reality that Nick had stepped into danger. On the other side was the fragile hope that this was only an accident. And I understand that feeling more than I wish I did. Because anyone who has loved someone deeply knows the temptation to ignore a bad sign for just a little longer, just to keep the illusion of peace alive for one more minute. Matt's situation only sharpened everything. His condition being at an alarming level meant the entire world was already burning. And now Nick was collapsing too. Nothing felt stable anymore. Nick had spent weeks fighting Matt Clark to save Sienna, and that fight didn't end cleanly. It left aftershocks. It left psychological bruises. It left Nick trapped in battle mode so long that his body forgot how to stop. And when someone forgets how to stop, they will do anything to keep moving. They'll numb the fear. They'll silence the pain. They'll push past the limit until they can't. Nick may not have wanted to face helplessness publicly, with Matt still in critical condition and Sienna still in danger. So he found a way to turn down the volume of reality. And that unmarked bottle on the floor looked like the evidence of that choice. When Nick was finally carried out on a stretcher, Sharon followed like a ghost. And to me, this wasn't just a medical emergency scene. It felt like a turning point. Because after this moment, Sharon will never see Nick the same way again. Even if she desperately wants to. Not because her love will be weaker, but because she's seen him at his most fragile. And that changes how fear lives in you. It makes love mature, but it also makes it heavier. Sharon might start living in a constant state of watchfulness, reading Nick's moods, scanning his eyes, searching for signs, trying to protect him from himself. But that kind of vigilance can suffocate a relationship, too. The tragedy of storylines like this is that recovery isn't only physical. It's emotional. It's trust. And trust is always the most fragile part. At the hospital, Nick's future hovered like a blade in the air. Sharon waited, and waiting felt like punishment. Every second stretched too long. She could be praying and blaming herself at the same time, terrified yet forcing herself to stay upright. And that mysterious bottle, whether it was still with her or not, stayed alive in her mind, like a haunting. Sharon knew that even if Nick survived, even if he woke up, the question of that bottle would not disappear. It would follow them. It would stain everything. It would create suspicion about what Nick had done in the past weeks, about what he might still be hiding. And to me, that is the most frightening part, not simply the risk of Nick dying, but the risk of Nick living while keeping secrets, forcing Sharon to love a man she isn't sure she fully knows anymore. I've always been struck by how Y&R turns love and family into relentless tests. Sharon isn't new to pain, but every time it hits her, it arrives in a different shape. This time it isn't an obvious betrayal or a public enemy she can fight. It's something murky and hidden, something that leaves her unsure who the villain even is. Sharon is battling Nick's medical crisis, the truth behind the bottle, and her own heart, whether she has the strength to face whatever comes next. Part of her might want to hide that bottle, not to protect Nick from consequences, but to protect herself from admitting that Nick has entered a darker place than she can handle. Sharon wanted this reunion to be healthy, to be right, but the bottle reminds her that Nick can still break, still fall, still hurt himself, and Sharon cannot love him enough to stop it. If he refuses to choose a different path, and then the uncertainty becomes even more cruel, what will Sharon say? When the doctors ask again about that bottle, will she tell the truth immediately, or will she hesitate, dodge, delay just to keep control over the story for one more breath? In real life, the answer should be simple: tell the truth to save him. But Y&R is never that clean. It always asks what truth costs and who pays for it. Sharon might speak up and save Nick medically, but ignite consequences that explode beyond her control. Or she might stay silent and create a new fracture in their love. Because secrets, no matter how well-intended, are still secrets. And secrets always find a way to rot what they touch. So this moment can't end with false relief. It has to end with that tight, suffocating suspense you built, Nick in critical condition. An unmarked bottle, Sharon trapped in an impossible choice. Sharon stands in the hospital corridor, her heart squeezed by a violent mix of love and fear. She watches Nick disappear deeper into the emergency wing, like he's being pulled out of her reach again. And just when she thinks she only has to wait for the question of life or death, another detail cuts in like a final wound. That bottle isn't just suspicious, it looks like something that never should have been in Nick's home at all. Sharon realizes that saving Nick won't only mean surviving this night. It will mean uncovering what that bottle really is before the truth behind it swallows both of them whole. And as Sharon grips her phone, preparing to answer the next question the medical team throws at her, her eyes suddenly stop. Cows, a new notification flashes across her screen. A final trace left behind by Nick only minutes before he collapsed, and just seeing the timestamp is enough to tell Sharon the most devastating thing of all. Nick tried to tell her something important, something urgent, something he couldn't carry alone anymore, and she arrived exactly one heartbeat too late. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.